Good morning, everyone. Welcome to their second Saturday program. I'm Alan Lusk, and I am hosting the program today. And we've got an exciting program, so I'm going to let Susan Knowles, who's our program chair at the Friends of Hagerman, introduce our speaker today.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad you tuned in to this program. Loriann got her PhD at Texas A&M, and it was in entomology. She is now teaching at Austin College, and not only does she teach entomology, but she teaches other subjects like plant and animal interactions, evolution, other programs like that. We are very pleased that she is here today to tell us about true bugs and who they are. Loriann?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I've been teaching here at Austin College. It's hard to imagine, but it's been 6 years now. And so I got started in the entomology program at A&M, and I kind of never looked back in the bug department. So in fact, I studied the true bugs as part of my graduate work. And so I could probably talk to you all about for hours on this particular group of insects. But it is really diverse, and there's some nuances that sometimes can be difficult to understand, but I'm going to try to make it easy. And they are, like I said, very diverse. This is the 5th largest order of insects, being surpassed by the insects that are the beetles, the flies, butterflies, and the Hymenoptera, or the bees, wasps, and ants. But this is the 5th largest order. I do welcome questions at any point. In fact, I'll probably ask questions along the way. I tend to be a very Socratic teacher, and so it just comes out naturally that I start asking a lot of questions. Anyways, let's get started. So let me go forward. All right. So I want everyone to be aware that not all insects are bugs, but all bugs are insects. And so what an entomologist means by that is that there's a specific order of insects called the Hymenoptera that we call the bugs. And anyways, so if an entomologist is talking about bugs, we're probably talking about Hymenoptera. And what the Hymenoptera as a classification really means is hemi and ptera. Hemi meaning half, and ptera with a silent P referring to winged. And so if you were to look at kind of like the classical representations of the Hymenopterans, you would see that their wings are about half leathery and half membranous. And so this is different than the beetles that have more of a full shell-like wing, and it's different than from the flies whose wings are like completely membranous. So they have this kind of half and half, and it's their front wings that are this way. The hind wings will be fully membranous, and those are more or less what they're using to fly. But the front wings are this, what we call the hemi-elytra, or these half leathery wings. And so this is kind of one of the main key features. Again, very diverse group. We have about 80,000, probably more species than that. And there's 134 families, so a lot of diversity. I won't be talking about all 134 groups, but we'll get through a few. All right, so we have these half leathery wings. We also, if you are Hymenopterans, you are an insect with incomplete metamorphosis. So there's no pupa stage. And so whenever you're out in the natural world, some Hymenopterans do find their way inside. I'll talk about a few of those. But if you're out in the natural world and you're looking at some insects, you may see some that are immature and have a characteristic that we call the wing buds. And so if you are an insect with incomplete metamorphosis, that means your wings are developing externally and you have no pupa stage. So as the insect molts, usually there's about 4 to 5 molts before they molt into their adult stage. Those little wing buds just kind of get a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bigger. And then for their adult stage, they have the full wings, which tend to be the hemi-elytra, or the half leathery. And so if you see an insect out there with wing buds, it's probably an immature Hemiptera. There's some other options it might be, but if it's going to be an adult, it'll have the fully developed wings. So there are definitely some other insects out there with incomplete metamorphosis, but the thing that's going to differentiate the Hemiptera is the next piece is actually the mouth parts. And so the Hemiptera actually have more of a straw or a beak, and they use it to pierce and suck. We call it piercing, sucking, feeding. And they are going to be piercing into both plant material and animal material, depending on which group they're in. Sometimes the technical term for this is rostrum, but they are liquid feeders. Okay, so it's very similar to the spiders in that there's no chewing involved in their feeding. And so, for example, when our predator Hemiptera feeds, the exoskeleton of the prey item gets left over because they can't actually chew on it. You'll notice on the photo on the right, the mouth part seems to be in two pieces, where there's a thick piece and a thin piece, kind of like a needle. What's really happening with the mouth parts, I'm actually going to come back to that slide, is there is basically a sheath, so like a sword sheath, and the insect folds it and then inserts the more needle-like parts into what they're feeding on. So this diagram is meant to represent a set of cells here at the bottom. And those cells, again, can be plant or animal, but they're going to fold back this sheath, and this needle-like mouth parts called the stylets is actually what gets inserted. It's actually quite similar to how the mosquito mouth parts work. And so this is a side view here on the left and a view from underneath on the right. So it's these needle-like ones that get inserted. If you were to take a cross section of the needle part, what you're really going to see is, this diagram is a little bit confusing, so hopefully I can explain easily. There's actually 4 interlocked pieces, and the 2 inner pieces form essentially canals. And one canal is where the food comes up, and the other canal is called the salivary canal, so they are able to excrete saliva. The hemipterans are actually what we call, they do some pre-digestion. So they do what we call extra oral digestion. And so what that means is when they're feeding plant or animal, they actually inject saliva. And in that saliva are some enzymes that are kind of going to dissolve the cells that they're feeding on. And then they kind of suck it up like a cellular soup. This is different than the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes are also injecting saliva, but their saliva is going to have anticoagulants. That's kind of the reason why they do that. In this case, this is pre-oral digestion. So they're trying to digest, turn it into a liquid form, and then they can suck it up. And so we got these 4 interlocking pieces that make 2 tubes, one for food, one for saliva. And so that's kind of how that works. All right, so key features: if you're in hemipteran, you may see the half leathery wings. You're definitely going to see a piercing, sucking mouth parts, and you may see wing buds because they have incomplete metamorphosis. Okay. Now, within the hemipterans, there's a couple of what we call the suborders. So Hemiptera is an order, and there's a couple of suborders. And this is where it gets a little especially confusing sometimes. One of the suborders, the Heteroptera, is in fact the quote unquote true bugs. But there are a couple of other suborders that are really closely related that are still in the hemipteran. Historically, they were not, but at least in the last 10 to 20 years, they've all been kind of lumped together. And so the other 3 are a little bit of a mouthful to pronounce. And so I tend to practice with my students in class. I have them repeat after me. And so you're welcome to repeat after me in the safety of your mute button. But we have on top here the Sternorhyncha, the Oncanarhyncha, and then the Colarhyncha, and then the Heteroptera is a little bit easier to pronounce. I definitely have maybe a little bit of scary memories of graduate school practicing saying these things and also trying to memorize how to spell them. Lots of self-spelling quizzes on this so I can get through graduate school without embarrassment. Anyways, on this slide, I just have a few examples of a couple of true bugs. You guys may know these. I'm going to go through a few more specifically, but one kind of fun one that you'll definitely see at the wildlife refuge, if you're anywhere near the water, are the boatmen. These are heteropterans. They tend to be kind of like scavengers, but they'll have their legs out to the side, more or less like oars. There's also a lot of bugs that we call the plant bugs. These are more or less herbivorous. You can see the hemelytra on this creature on the flower. It's called the tarnished plant bug. And then we have a few exceptions. So there are actually a couple of heteropterans that are blood feeders, including the infamous bed bug. You'll notice the bed bug doesn't have any wings. So this is an exception whereby even the adult bed bugs don't have wings. So you're not going to see wings on a bed bug, probably, thank goodness. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few more specific examples of what we call the true bugs or the Heteroptera. All right, so some examples of the Heteroptera. Oh, here's another slide to indicate the partially leathery wings. It's another plant bug in this picture. But several cases in the Heteropterans are what we might call good garden bugs, right? So we have a lot of predators. One of the main predators of the bugs are the assassin bugs, and there's a lot of diversity. Some are going to be active hunters and others are more like ambush hunters. If you're wondering if you have a predatory bug or a plant feeding bug, usually the key thing that's going to give it away is how thick is the beak. If anyone's ever come across a wheel bug, you'll notice like this is a very thick beak. It's almost the same width as the whole head put together. Typically the predatory bugs have very thick beaks, whereas the plant feeders have very thin ones, almost like needles. And so this in this picture is what we call the wheel bug. It's probably one of the biggest assassin bugs that we have. They're fairly common and they tend to surprise people in their size. They can be like 3 inches at the largest. I don't recommend picking these up with your bare hands. If they do decide that you are a threat, they can bite. And because their beak is large, you will feel it. And because, again, they are doing extra oral digestion, they may try to inject some saliva into you. And so if your cells start dissolving, that sounds way more dramatic than it would actually be. It does hurt. So don't get bit by one of these. But anyways, but they're out there eating some other pest insects that you may not want. Let's see, my next one. This is a much smaller assassin bug relative. We call these the ambush bugs. I just love these. They're like little tanks and they're almost similar to like praying mantises in that their front legs are a little bit raptorial, so they can actually grab onto things before they pierce. But these are going to be much smaller, maybe like ½ an inch. And they tend to have really good camouflage. So these, if you're not looking carefully, you may not ever see them, especially when they're hiding amongst flowers. I just love these. These are called the ambush bugs. All right. This little predator is sometimes a trickster. So sometimes I even get tricked by this. This is the broad-headed bug. And in these pictures, actually all 3 of these pictures I have, you'll notice there's wing buds rather than fully developed wings. When the wings are fully developed, really what that's going to mean is it covers completely the abdomen. But if it's just on the thorax, then they're not really mature yet. These broad-headed bugs are really good. The immatures are really good ant mimics. And so sometimes even I get tricked because they're small and they look like ants. But you can see from a side view, they actually do have a backward facing piercing sucking mouth part. So that little straw right there. And that's going to be the giveaway, in addition to the wing buds, that this is actually hemipteran and not an ant. But these are little predators running around in the natural world pretty commonly. So yeah, most of these bugs are going to be, you can find them here locally in Texas. There's various species that I'm showing you. But just generally, these groups are fairly common around. That was a question from the chat. Thank you. Okay, so take a look out for those. Also, if you're hanging around the refuge, you may have seen some giant water bugs. Okay, so these are aquatic predatory hemipterans. You can, when they are out of the water, they can fly. Typically, if they're going to fly, it's going to be at night, and it's because they're trying to move from one pond to another. And so if you ever get a chance to do night collecting on insects, this honestly, when I catch them the most is at night. The other times I catch them is when I'm using aquatic nets. But they do have the Hemielytra wing types. And these can be fairly big, the giant water bugs, 2 to 4 inches. There's kind of a smaller version that's about 2 inches, but both of these species are considered the giant water bugs. And kind of fun fact about these is the larger ones can actually prey on vertebrates. So they'll be out there catching tadpoles and other small fish. But probably most of their prey are other invertebrates like dragonfly larvae, mayfly larvae, and other aquatic insects. So kind of a fun fact about the giant water bugs is actually, this is one of the few animal cases where it's actually the males that kind of take care of the eggs. And so this is a picture of a male water bug. And what's on the back are actually eggs. So the female water bug mates with the male. And then when the eggs are fertilized, she actually lays them on the back of the male. And then the male just goes about his regular life, you know, catching and eating things with the eggs on his back. And it's thought that this process, you know, is 2 things. One, avoiding egg predation because the male can move around and avoid things, but also the water flow over the eggs is likely helping to aerate them and make sure that they stay oxygenated in the water. In this particular picture, what you're seeing is that some of the eggs are already hatched and others are not. So the kind of deflated, broken bumps on here are the hatched eggs, and the ones that look like little ping pongs are not hatched yet. But so we have some dads in some single dads in the giant water bugs. So you might find them in this stage. All right. Just very quickly, probably about 99% of my photographs are from a insect photographer named Alex Wild. If insect photography is interesting to you, he is actually a entomologist that works for UT Austin. He hosts photography workshops every now and then. He's pretty renowned in the entomology world, but he does have a gallery of photos on his website, Alex Wild Photography. And just generally they're available for educational use, but you can also, of course, purchase them and learn from him. So just be aware, these are not my photographs. I do not have these skills. I could find the insects. I won't be taking good pictures, but Alex Wild takes really good pictures. Okay, I'm kind of curious if anybody's encountered this critter, very, very small hemipterans. You might let me know in the chat. These are what we call the minute pirate bugs. These tend to be running around on flowers, hunting down very small herbivores like aphids or even thrips sometimes. Here's a penny for reference, like exceptionally small, hence minute. I've actually also heard, I've never experienced this, but I've had people from the north tell me that sometimes they can kind of outbreak in turf areas. And if you're like, for example, I have friends that play soccer and they tell me sometimes they're out on the turf and playing soccer, and there's just so many of these bugs that they actually get bitten by them. And so I have to reassure them that it's just an accidental bite. They actually don't have any interest in feeding on you. They're not blood feeders. They're just trying to make a living, and you just happen to be there at the wrong place in the wrong time. So if you ever come across the minute pirate bugs, those are pretty good predators. You can actually purchase these as biocontrol agents if you find the right source. All right, I love this picture. Here's a really good picture of the feeding style of a hemipteran. You'll notice feeding on this caterpillar. The caterpillar is relatively soft-bodied, but this little predatory hemipteran will not be able to feed on the exoskeleton. Again, it's going to liquefy the insides, similar to a spider, and then suck it up like a straw. All right, let's talk about some of the plant feeders. Thank you for the link. Yep, that's the right one. Okay, so some of you are probably familiar with what we call the stink bugs. There's a really high diversity of the stink bugs. This one on the right that's colorful is called the harlequin bug. Stink bugs can often be pests in gardens. They are feeding a lot of times on fruits or newly developing fruits. You can actually see from the underside on the picture on the left, the mouth part is kind of tucked under the front legs when it's not feeding. But they're called stink bugs, of course, because they have glands. They'll exude stinky stuff when they're disturbed, and that's their best way to not get eaten. Some of the other plant feeders I get asked a lot about are, for example, the leaf-footed bugs. So this is a picture on the left of an adult leaf-footed bug, given its name from the kind of flat panels it has on its hind legs that can sometimes be exceptionally large, and they kind of look like leaves. Sometimes these get confused with assassin bugs because they tend to be a little bit larger in size. But if you look at carefully at the picture of the nymphs on the right, the beaks are much thinner than what like a predatory bug would have. The immatures actually do tend to kind of like stay in groups. And so in a garden, you may notice groups of them, and they can be easily mistaken for aphids. However, this example would be of leaf-footed bugs, immatures in a group. They tend to be feeding again on like developing buds or newly developing fruits. Okay, I know we have a bunch of naturalists who may be really interested in milkweeds. And so you've probably seen these before. This is the milkweed bug. Again, their immatures tend to hang out in groups. They tend to be feeding on the seed pods of milkweed plants. You'll notice that both the immatures and the adults have this red and black coloring. And so similar to the monarch caterpillar, these bugs, and actually most of the herbivorous bugs that feed on milkweed, are dealing with the toxicity by sequestering it. So these bugs, in fact, are also toxic, just like a monarch caterpillar is. And so predators tend to avoid them. And so, yeah, they're going to be seed pod feeders on the milkweed plants. Okay, I have two bugs to explain that are of medical and public health interest. And so I would be curious to know if any of you have run into these. The first one, maybe a little bit more concern in regards to diseases, is what we call the quote unquote kissing bug. So there's very few hemipterans that are blood feeders, but this is one of the groups. There's a couple of different species of what are called the kissing bugs, but they can be vectors of what's called the Chagas disease. And Chagas disease as a disease is very similar to like malaria in that it's a single-celled parasite that gets in your bloodstream. In this case, if a human has symptoms, it's going to be cardiac or stomach issues. It tends to not, at least in the United States, there's not very many cases of infection, like a symptomatic infection in humans, although there are documented cases of humans in the United States who have the Chagas disease. Usually those are folks who had recently traveled from Latin America, so Central and South America, because these insects are highly abundant in Central and South America, and also the parasite is in more abundance. And so in this picture, you see the kissing bug, and I'll talk about the name for it in a minute. You can see a little bit of a thick beak here piercing into some skin, and then the background image is of the parasite itself with some blood cells in the background. If you ever want to know more about the kissing bug, Texas A&M kind of facilitates the state's knowledge bank on that, and they do the research. And so they have a website, it's pretty easy, kissingbug.tamu.edu. TAMU stands for Texas A&M University. So a little bit more about this, so not everyone gets too concerned. Well, I should. with this picture, maybe you're going to be concerned. The reason why it's called the kissing bug is they tend to be nocturnal feeders. So if they're going to bite, it's going to be at night. And so what happens is they try to find a soft tissue place, and they tend to really like eyelids, and they tend to really like around your lips, which is why they're called the kissing bug. And so if a person is bit by them, they tend to have a swelling in the at the bite site. And in fact, it's not really the bite that causes the infection, but rather it's when you itch afterwards. So there's going to be irritation. And the reason why people get infected is the parasite's actually in the feces of the insect. And so when there's irritation and the bug is feeding on you and it defecates, it's actually from the feces by which the parasite gets into your skin or the wound that's created by the bite. So it's not the bite directly, but it's indirectly through the feces. Makes it a little bit different than mosquitoes. Now, these insects, again, there's a couple of different species, and they can be a little bit robust, not too big, maybe about an inch or inch and a half at most. Usually what I'm looking for, if I think I have a kissing bug, is I'm looking for kind of like the stripes around the edges of the abdomen. You can see the hemelytra in the center, and they tend to be alternating colors here with dark and light, sometimes with a little bit of red. Again, they also have a little bit of a thicker beak. There are a lot of lookalikes. And so you got to be cautious before you misdiagnose something as a kissing bug. And that's where Texas A&M can help, because you're always welcome to, well, you can always email me, but if you want to contact Texas A&M directly, they'll respond to emails about pictures. And then if they do in fact think you have a kissing bug, they are going to ask you to actually mail it to them because they're going to want to test it for the presence of the parasite. So when it comes to this bug and insects that have been detected to actually have the parasite, we do have cases of positive disease-carrying bugs in Grayson County. This little light orange color in the map, this is Texas A&M's map, indicates about 50 insects that have been tested positive in Grayson County. To be clear, there's not that I'm aware of any human cases like local to Grayson County, but there have been insects found to have the parasites. And it seems to be the more south in Texas you go, the more incidence there is. And then if you get into Central and South America, the incidence tends to be really high. There have been, epidemiological studies where they've looked at, people who've reported to be bitten. And there's just not really any human cases other than people who've traveled from Latin America. Where there are cases is actually in dogs. And so this is, I'm a dog owner, so sometimes I think about this. This is a data slide from, let's see. Well, it's a data slide that was created with data generated from Homeland Security, because they have several locations across the United States where they have kennels where they're training Homeland Security dogs. And so they used that population of dogs in kennels to do this study. And so they looked at the nationwide exposure of US working dogs to the Chagas disease parasite. And what this data is showing is the size of the circle indicates how many dogs they tested. And then the red portion of the pie graphs are how many of the dogs were positive, and the blue portion is how many of the dogs were negative for Chagas disease. And you can see there's a small proportion in most areas, but there is variation in whether or not the dogs have infection. Now, my understanding is that a lot of times infections on this can go undetected. And so that makes it difficult to have accurate data. And a lot of dogs are asymptomatic, but it can, for example, cause cardiac arrest in dogs if the case is severe. And so if you have a kennel or you keep dogs outside routinely, especially at night, just be aware that dogs tend to be susceptible to Chagas disease, even though humans in the United States tend to not be. All right. And this is a case where if you want to know more about medical cases, Texas A&M is probably where I would direct you. Okay. All right, let's talk about the bed bug for a few minutes. Okay, so again, this is a hemipteran, even though the it's wingless, so it's one of the exceptions. I hope you guys maybe haven't encountered them. I have two kind of personal stories about bed bugs. One is, when you're in an entomology department and you're surrounded by very nerdy people who really like bugs. And so I did have a graduate school peer who actually had a pet bed bug. And so every now and then he would feed it. And so he'd have it in a vial, he'd put it on his skin and let it feed on him. The good news about that is bed bugs are actually not known to vector any diseases. And so that's, in a way, these are quote unquote kind of safe blood feeders. And the CDC and other groups associated with the Entomological Society of America, whenever there's a new and emerging disease of any kind, literally the first things that are done in the lab are, do bed bugs transmit this? Do mosquitoes transmit this? Can the kissing bug transmit this? There's folks out there doing the tests necessary to have the understanding. And no, there hasn't been any disease transmission from bed bugs, thank goodness. The other kind of personal story I have that makes me giggle is I was at an entomological meeting in Reno, and we were students at the time, another group of students in another hotel room actually had found bed bugs in the hotel room. And so they went to the front lobby to say, hey, there's bed bugs in our room. Can we get a different room? And the receptionist and the manager actually tried to deny that there was bed bugs until we made it very clear that we were there as entomologists for an entomological society meeting. And then they got bumped up to a higher room. So that was kind of funny to me. Fortunately, there wasn't any bed bugs in my hotel room. Bed bugs can hitch rides. Once they start feeding, I think I have a picture of them. Here's a biter. Okay, so again, piercing, sucking mouth part. But this is kind of what they look like over time as they're feeding. They kind of go from flat to engorged. But once they have a blood meal, they don't actually have to feed for a very long time, like several months. And so that's why they're really good hitchhikers, because if they manage to make it into your suitcase, you could bring them home, but then it's really not till a couple months later that you might notice them, because they're wandering around at night trying to find a host. And if it takes them a couple of months, they'll be fine, and they'll start a new colony, more or less. So those are some bed bugs. Hopefully you guys haven't experienced this. There's definitely a wide variety in how the bites present themselves. Sometimes, as an entomologist, I get people contacting me with pictures of potential bug bites of various kinds, spider bites. I really cannot diagnose bites, okay? But just be on the lookout. The symptoms may look like this. Kind of a fun fact about the bed bugs is they do this mating style called traumatic insemination. And so it's thought that this kind of is an artifact of competition amongst male bed bugs for females. And so really what that means is that instead of inseminating the female bugs through her genital tract, because she has one, they pierce the side of the female on her abdomen and inject the sperm in that way. And the females are actually damaged, but enough females survive and the sperm gets to where it needs to go and the cycle continues. But yeah, the bed bug males do what we call traumatic insemination. So I'll let you guys think about that. Another group of animals that's known to do that is, just for fun, it's not an insect, but the giant squids. And so it's thought that because there's, low population sizes of giant squids out in the ocean, that when one giant squid sees another giant squid, especially the males, they're super motivated to get their mating in, because they may not have another chance. And so they tend to kind of just attach on to another squid and do a traumatic insemination just to get it over with. And then the females get fertilized in that way. Let's see, why do people get so bent out of shape? Okay, yeah. So I have had a question about like kind of responses to bed bugs. Honestly, I think it's, we have kind of innate responses of disgust. So like across cultures, disgust as an emotion is consistent. And usually with the research on disgust, often disgust is associated with disease bearing or disease causing organisms or disease or like feces or urine or blood or whatever, things that people can get infections from. And so I think it's in regards to the bed bugs, one, people just don't know they don't carry diseases. But also, it's a blood feeder and that's not pleasant. It's annoying. People don't like to think about that they don't have good hygiene. They don't like to think about their home not being clean. In regards to like destroying mattresses, that is an effective way to get rid of bed bugs. So if you have a bed bug infestation, it can be difficult to get rid of in the absence of like fogging. And I don't really recommend fogging just because those types of insecticides are not going to be specific to the bed bugs, but rather it would kill almost any invertebrate in your home. And then there may be residues, et cetera, that you or your pets are exposed to, or your children. And so in regards to destroying mattresses, that's more of a, it's a chemical-free way to deal with bed bugs. We live in Texas, and so an alternative to destroying your mattress could be, for example, if it's the summertime, you can put your mattress out on the driveway and let the sun heat it up. Heat kills bed bugs. And so typical advice for getting rid of bed bugs are, for example, washing and drying your sheets in a very high heat, or as high heat as your machines will go. The sun will also heat up things hot enough to kill bed bugs. You got to do vacuuming. They're not just in mattresses. They can be in any sort of framework of your bed. They can be behind picture frames, behind nightstands. There can be around your bed, but not necessarily just in the mattress or like in the seams of the mattress. And so kind of the evidence, if you have bed bugs, even if you haven't seen one, are going to be like rust colored stains on your mattresses because when they defecate, it's mostly blood. And so it has a little bit of a red color when they defecate. Do you guys have any other questions about these bed bugs? I can attempt to answer now or later. Thank you. You guys have good questions here in the chat. All right. I probably have about, I guess about 10 or 15 more minutes. You see tiny vestigial wings. I've never really seen it described that way. So there are kind of these larger plates here on the thorax area. Me looking at it, I would not describe that as a wing bud of any kind. I really just think that's kind of a larger plate that's normal for a thorax. Also, just, as a side note, like the word bug, okay, is thought to have originated from human cultures having a name for the bed bug. So the bed bugs have been called bugs for a long time. And then it's my understanding that the name bug was then more broadly applied to the taxonomic group that they belong. And so the bugs and the true bugs get their name from bed bugs. I would love to do like an historical study of like references to bed bugs in like Roman and Greek literature or something like that. That would be fun. Okay. I'm going to move away from the Heteroptera and kind of touch on some of the other groups here, the Sternorhyncha and the Onchonorhyncha that you guys may encounter frequently. The Coleorhyncha, that group here, third down on the list, is actually not found in the United States. You'd have to go to Australia to find that one, and there's very few species. So I tend to not teach about that. But we have tons of Onchonorhyncha and we have tons of Sternorhyncha. And this first group that I'm going to touch on is the Sternorhyncha. This is like a group of a bunch of weirdos, and I don't really have a better way to explain it because they have such a wide variety of life cycles that are very unique to each particular insect. They tend to be soft-bodied, and so they don't have as much like chitin in their exoskeleton as other insects do. And they tend to be wingless a lot, even as adults, or they have life cycles where males are winged, but females are not, or they're only winged some time of the year and not other parts of the year. So there's like, and any kind of exception you want to think of, it's probably going to be in the Sternorhyncha. And so I'm going to talk about a few examples like I have on my slides here. Probably the one that most people are aware of is, sure, I see a question in the chat I'll get to in a second, because you might consider the aphids bad bugs. Okay, so as an entomologist, I try really hard to not use the phrases bad bugs and good bugs, because those are going to be things that it depends on what your goals are as a landowner or a naturalist or a homeowner, right? And so typically the phrase good bug gets applied to things that are predators. And a lot of times the word bad bug gets applied to insects that are herbivores. But there's all kinds of nuances in the system that like even aphids in some case, they reproduce really quickly. And so you may see tons of them on any particular plant, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the plant is going to be harmed in a way that its fitness is reduced or yield is reduced. And actually some plants are better off hosting aphids than if they're not. And I can explain more about that as I go through a few more slides here. Like with my students, I'm always telling them, what's the data? What's the data? Don't just tell stories. What's the data? And so we got to be careful on the conclusions that we draw if we don't have any data to support it. All right, so here's an aphid. You can see the piercing sucking mouth part kind of going backwards underneath the head. This picture is of a milkweed aphid. And so, I'm sorry. Yep. Yeah, the Homooptera. Yeah, the Homoopteran has completely sunk as far as I know. That's an old group that was considered its own order. That word may be still used as a subclassification, but Hemipteran is the order. And then the suborders here are Oncanorhyncha, Sternorhyncha, and Heteroptera. Was there another question? Okay. So again, if you have milkweeds in your gardens, that's awesome. You may have the milkweed bugs, and you also may have the milkweed aphids. Just like the milkweed bugs, the aphids are able to sequester the toxins from the milkweed plant. And so that's reflected in their yellow coloration. Depending on the milkweed plant, there's some milkweed plants are very toxic, some are less toxic. In fact, the Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly weed or the milkweed that has the orange flowers, is actually not hardly toxic at all. Anyways, they can still be good hosts for monarchs and such. They just, if you actually analyze the herbivores that are feeding on them, they won't be toxic. Okay, so this is a milkweed aphid. I just love this picture. It's Alex Wild. So yeah, you got a mom aphid and a baby aphid here. Okay, so some fun things about aphids that may or not be widely appreciated. So the piercing sucking mouth part, right? So there's a kind of a needle, the needle thin part of the plant feeders is what's going inside the plant. And these things are exceptionally flexible. And what the aphids are really feeding on is what's called the phloem of the plant. So there's a little P here and the insert, that's standing for phloem. The phloem is the vascular tissue that the plant has where they're kind of moving nutrients back and forth in a stream. And so as the plant photosynthesizes, carbohydrates are created. Sometimes those are used, immediately, but sometimes they're stored, and the plant has ways of moving their energy and metabolites around. And one of the ways is through the phloem tissue. Oh, what does sequestration mean? Okay, yeah. So thank you for asking. Sequestration is going to mean that as the insects are feeding, they're exposed to toxins. And so the toxins are being ingested. But instead of, for example, excreting the toxin or breaking the toxin down and then excreting it, kind of like what our livers do when we have adult beverages, instead, what the insects are able to do is the sequestration process, which means they're able to essentially take that toxic chemical or molecule and move it somewhere where it's not going to cause any damage. It usually gets put in some glands or special cell types. And so then that toxin is basically in a reservoir in the body of the insect. And then the herbivore itself becomes toxic via the plant. They're not synthesizing their own toxins, but they're able to keep and hold on to the toxins from the plant without being damaged themselves. So that's what sequestration is going to mean. And a lot of insects are adapted to do that, especially the ones feeding on toxic plants like milkweeds. Thank you for the question. Okay, so aphids are phloem feeders, and their needle part of their mouth port is very, very flexible. And kind of the interesting thing, if you look at how they're able to insert their mouth part on a cross section, like under a microscope, you can kind of see how the mouth part is kind of weaving in and out in between the cells of the plant until it reaches the phloem. It's kind of similar to what a mosquito can do. But this is actually very important as to how the aphids interact with the plant, because the aphid is really interested in not causing a lot of like physical damage to all these other cells it has to bypass before it reaches the phloem. If it's able to bypass all these other cell types, then it's going to potentially avoid causing the plant to induce its defenses, which means sometimes when plants are damaged, they actually can ramp up the amount of toxins that they have. And aphids can avoid this because they're kind of stealthy and they can get to the phloem without damaging other cells. It's very flexible. And so this picture is showing a cross section of the insect mouth part inside leaf tissue. Yeah, the butterfly weed, the tuberosa, I can actually write that out in the chat here. So it's, for short, it's A. tuberosa. It's the milkweed that has the orange flowers, the flowers that are totally orange. There's another one that we call the tropical milkweed. I'm losing the, oh, that's the Quercus. Those flowers tend to be like orange on the outside and red on the inside. But if it's just full on orange, like an actual like physical orange or a basketball orange, it's going to be the butterfly weed. It's really hardly any toxins in there at all. I actually had a student do some chemistry on them, and we were able to see that for ourselves. All right, so the other feature of this picture you may notice is this little droplet coming out the rear end of the aphid. And so what's happening there is a lot of these hemipterans, especially in the Sternorhyncha, they actually don't have a lot of musculature associated with their mouth parts. Instead, they're relying on internal pressure of what they're feeding on to kind of force the liquid into their digestive systems, especially the aphids feeding on phloem. So essentially, they're not like pumping up, but rather it's just a flow based on the water pressure that's inside the plant. And so the artifact of that is these insects are actually ingesting more liquid than they can actually digest. And so the extra liquid just goes straight through the digestive system and back out the rear end, or what we call the anus of the insect. We use the same name. This aphid here has wing buds, just to point that out. And so this is essentially extra plant phloem that the insect is not able to digest because it has too much flowing into its mouth. And some of you may know that other insects actually take advantage of this. Ants are very sugar motivated. They are omnivores in the most case. They are scavenging for other insects, but they do want quick, easy access to sugar, just like we do. And the best way, probably the easiest way for them to get sugar is either from the phloem that is coming extra out of an aphid, or they'll actually feed on plant nectar as well. And so whenever you see ants and aphids interacting, it's often called tending, because the ants are usually not taking time to eat the aphids, but rather they're collecting the little sugar drops coming out of the rear end of the aphid. And this has a specific name, and we call it honeydew, like the honeydew melon. Fun fact about this is aphids are not the only insects that do this. Another Sternorhyncha called the scale actually will do this as well, whereby it's exuding droplets of extra plant phloem. And there's actually some caterpillars that do it also. And so ants will tend a variety of insects in addition to aphids. All right, some more kind of fun facts about how aphids work in regards to their life cycle. Here's an aphid. This is a mom aphid. She's tapped into the plant. So aphids have a life cycle where during the kind of normal growing season, the colonies are all female, and they're asexual, meaning they don't need sexual reproduction to reproduce. And they're one of the only insects that do live birth. And so this is a live birth of an aphid coming from mom. And so she's able to birth live aphids instead of laying eggs. And so what's happening here, because they're asexual, is that these little baby aphids are essentially clones of mom. And so there's very little genetic diversity in typical aphid colonies, which makes them actually a really good animal to study scientifically, because we can do all kinds of experiments and not have to deal with variation due to genetics, because they tend to be clones of each other. Mom can produce multiple babies per hour. And so aphid colonies tend to increase exponentially. And then during the fall, it's not really well understood how this happens, but during the fall, they'll go through a sexual life cycle whereby some of the offspring that are born are going to be male. And then there is some sexual reproduction that happens. And then the aphids kind of go dormant over winter. They're either in stems or kind of in any sort of tightly curled leaf. And then they emerge the next year and start the asexual life cycle again. The other feature of the aphids is that they are what we call plastic, in that they don't always have wings. They tend to form wings in response to the environment. And so if there's overcrowding, or their plant is not good for them anymore, or there's predators, what will happen is mom will have babies, and those babies will be winged. And then that generation is able to disperse to a new plant to avoid any of those stressors. Okay, so you're going to come across colonies where probably most of the individuals are not winged, and some of them are, and it has to do with environmental conditions, whether or not that occurs. So here's an aphid about to take flight. All right, lady beetles are a friend against the aphids. If you have an infestation that you don't want, lady beetles can eat hundreds of aphids. The other type of insect that's going to be really good kind of controlling aphid populations are the parasitoids. So these are very, very small wasps that will lay an egg inside an aphid. And then what happens is the little wasp larvae develops inside the aphid, and over time the aphid is dead because it's being eaten from the inside. And what happens that you see visually is it kind of becomes this like inflated little husk. These little brown inflated insects here on the right are what we call insect or aphid mummies. Mummies is the technical term that entomologists use. But when you have an aphid that's been infested by a parasitoid, it will become a mummy. And then eventually an adult parasitoid will hatch out, and you'll know that's happened because there'll be a hole in the side of the aphid mummy. And so I definitely encourage anyone who is interested in reducing aphid population numbers to first see if the predators like the ladybugs or the parasitoids can help you before you start spraying insecticides, because those insecticides will also negatively harm these other insects. Just a fun fact, you can also actually purchase parasitoids for biological control, similar to how you can purchase lady beetles. Okay, I think the last insect I'm going to talk about more formally here is the scales. And then I'll have time for more questions, or if there's another hemipteran or other insect that you guys want to ask me about, we can do. So the scales are, again, one of the exceptional weirdos. There's all kinds of scales. So when you see a scale, sometimes they just look like a bump on a twig. Sometimes they look like these little waxy bumps, and sometimes they can look like little starfish. There's so much diversity. What's happening here is they have a really weird life cycle where the adult females are sessile or non-moving. And so they do actually have a piercing sucking mouth part, but that the female adult scale is tapping into the plant and then she's not moving anymore. She's able to reproduce, however, because the males are mobile and they're winged. And so this is just a diagram where the adult females just kind of look like blobs. There is some stages where they're able to move, and in that stage they're called crawlers when they're first born. But again, once the female is an adult, she's tapped in, she's not moving anymore. But then the males actually do go through like a pupal stage and become more of like a regular looking insect. And so the males will fly around and mate with the sessile females. These can be pretty significant agricultural pests depending on what plant you're trying to go. Some citrus farms, for example, are susceptible to some scale outbreaks. But there's a couple of scales that we have uses for. And one is one type that you guys may encounter here is what we call the cochineal scale. And so this is a type of scale that's producing a lot of wax on the outside. So it just looks like a bunch of fluffy white stuff. Whenever these scales have this wax or wax type coverings, it's really a predator defense. But there's some predators that can get around this. But anyways, I definitely encourage you, just as a life experience, if you come across a cochineal scale, they're often on cactuses. So be careful with the cactus. But if you squash one, you'll see this really deep red colored, essentially insect blood that they have. Most insect blood is more like clear or greenish, but these are red. And there are actual cochineal scale farms, in particular in Mexico, where these are farmed to produce this red dye that's kind of natural. And so, natural, quote unquote, there's a lot of problems with that word. But if you look carefully at some food labels, for example, like strawberry yogurt, you might see an ingredient that'll say cochineal extract. And so what that means is they've added some squished up scales essentially to your yogurt to improve the red coloration. And in the past, there used to be headlines that were like, Starbucks puts bugs in your Frappuccino, and they were referring to the strawberry Frappuccino, and they're trying to make it look more appetizing by having it be more red. You can also use this to dye clothing. The last scale that I'll talk about directly is another type that produces kind of like this more like hard wax, and you call these lac scales. And there are lac scale farms in Asia, and they're essentially farming these scales to collect the wax, and then the wax is used in all kinds of products. And these lac scales, for example, if you ever come across a product that's called shellac, the main kind of ingredient of these products are going to be wax from the scales. And sometimes the wax is used as kind of like a glaze on candy. For example, candy corn. So I have a few more examples of bugs, including from the Onkennerinka, but since it's been about an hour, I do want to pause and just open the floor to general questions. But I'll just leave this Onkennerinka slide up here. So in case there's any specific questions about this group that I didn't get to, I am open to answering questions. Thank you for your attention and really good questions in the chat. Let's see. Insect collections. Okay, yeah. I'm definitely open to hosting some more insect collecting at the wildlife refuge. And so I definitely would encourage the organizers here to get in contact me to let me know how that can be organized. But yeah, I had fun with y'all collecting insects, so we should definitely do that again. Thank you for your feedback.
And anyone that wants to ask a question, feel free to unmute and ask your question or type it in the chat.
Sure. And if you want, I can help you practice saying these names out loud. Sternorhyncha, Oncanorhyncha, Coleorhyncha, and the Heteroptera. Becomes a mouthful. Let's see. What other plants beyond milkweeds have toxins as protection? So in fact, it's most plants. So a lot of plants are relying on chemicals to defend themselves. Dose makes the poison. And so we're actually eating a lot of them. So even things like broccoli and cabbage and tomato, the tomato and potato are in the same family of plants as tobacco. So the solanaceous plants, they do have nicotine. Eggplants have nicotine, tomatoes have nicotine. Now the plant parts that we're eating tend to be a little bit lower in nicotine, but it's there. But for like tobacco and like wild tobacco, so the domesticated tobacco and also the wild tobacco, they do have high, nicotine concentrations, as you guys probably know. And that's really an insect defense. No more strawberry yogurt. I'll still be eating strawberry yogurt. I tend to teach entomology on campus in the fall semester. And so if you want to come audit, I can point you in the right direction. We do have long-lived periodical cicadas. So, and I have a slide because I didn't get there yet. So I'm going to go forward to my slide just so we have a visual. There is a group of periodical cicadas that are on a similar life cycle as kind of what just emerged on the East Coast, but it's called brood 4. Okay, so all of these populations of cicadas have brood names, and the brood that you can find here in North Texas is brood 4. And brood 4 most recently emerged in 2015, and so the next time will be 2032. Yeah, I'm going to put my email in the chat here, make it a little bit easier, but it's lgarcia@austincollege.edu. The cicadas are in the Oncanorhyncha, which is the other group that I didn't get to talk about yet.
Well, this is a great program, Loriann. You can tell by all the comments in the chat there. People
Well,
enjoyed the program.
Yeah, well, maybe next time I'll talk exclusively on Canorhyncha.
Well, and I would encourage everyone to check out our Friends of Hagerman website. We are starting to open the Visitor Center and the Nature Nook back up this coming week, actually.
Awesome.
So hopefully before too long, we can have these in person there at the Visitor Center. So I would encourage you to check out the website. I know Bart Garcia is on. He's in charge of our tram rides, and you can now sign up for some of the tram rides. So they're filling up fast. If you want to get on a tram ride, you need to do it quickly. But at any rate, well, if no one else has any questions, we can go ahead and close our program. It will be provided out on the website, a link to the video so you can rewatch this. And if you have any interest, or you can share it with some of your friends. So we're getting more kudos coming in there.
Thank you so much. I hope you all have a great weekend. You stay warm today. And, if you don't get outside today, let's get outside tomorrow.
Sounds good. Thanks again.
All right, y'all have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.